What a fight at the Tokyo Dome between Naoya Inoue and Junto Nakatani, with Naoya Inoue being declared the winner by unanimous decision. I personally scored this fight 116 to 112. A 4-round victory for Naoya Inoue over Junto Nakatani. I know that some people had the fight closer. It really all depends on what you liked. But the truth is, it was very impressive to me that Nakatani was able to have stretches of this fight where he was able to really control the ring and walk down Inoue. He was definitely the most dangerous and difficult opponent of Inoue's entire career, and we've definitely never seen Inoue as hesitant to try to trade with somebody as he was with Nakatani. This fight was so cagey for the first 6-7 rounds that it really reminded me of another famous open stance matchup, Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao. And unfortunately, I was going to sit here and be like, am I really going to have to compare this fight to Mayweather Pacquiao right now? I was thinking about my post-fight video during the fight, and I was like, am I really going to have to compare this to Mayweather Pacquiao? Unfortunately, as the fight wore on, as we got to round 6, round 7, and they started to slow down and tire a little bit, you got some very energetic exchanges, some great trading. And of course, I mean, I think this was always going to be a little bit better of a fight than Mayweather Pacquiao, because both of these guys have such genuine power. And it really speaks that Inoue was so afraid of Nakatani's power at 122. I really didn't expect that. I mean, he was less afraid of Nakatani's power than most Nakatani opponents. He definitely took a page out of Sebastian Hernandez's book in this fight, Inoue, especially in those late rounds where he was not afraid to just stand in front of Nakatani and trade. And just, do what Hernandez did and just plant his feet directly in front of Nakatani, and not allow Nakatani to move. Although this fight, a lot like the Zurdo Ramirez versus David Benavidez fight this weekend, which was also a tremendous fight, there wasn't a lot of circular movement. There wasn't a lot of boxing, as the American boxing sense sort of thinks it. There wasn't a lot of stick and move. It was very vertical, very horizontal, perpendicular movement between the fighters. Not a lot of circles, not a lot of semicircles, not a lot of real angles being shown other than on the inside with, the classic duck and weave under. There are a lot of movement, a lot of angles being shown that way, but not a lot of angles being shown from classic boxing. And that's sort of why I'm not super enthusiastic for a rematch, actually, because I sort of read it, actually, especially from Inoue, as I think they both kind of saved their boxing for the rematch, right? This was a little bit more of actually authentically throwing hands. Most of the caginess in that first round was just either them, feinting. It was a feint fest, a lot of feinting, a lot of dodging, but definitely not a lot of impactful jabbing. If there was jabbing, Inoue got it off, and that's what you had to score those rounds off of. I think that Inoue won, especially the early parts of the fight, right? I said that the key for Inoue in this fight, something that was always going to be true in this fight, and it was true, is that Inoue was going to dominate the early rounds and the late rounds. So it was really hard for me to pick the fight for Nakatani. Well, that's exactly what happened, and that's what happens when you have a better jab, right? And Inoue does have a better jab. Now, he doesn't have a fancy kind of low center of gravity flicker jab, southpaw flicker jab that's fun to watch like Nakatani, but he has a really firm, hard, and extremely accurate and technically perfect jab that Nakatani doesn't have, that he can genuinely put weight on, and that is a genuine punch. Like, Nakatani is a southpaw. Inoue isn't a switch hitter, but he punches like a switch hitter. He's got 2 fists like a switch hitter. Nakatani very definitely has a strong hand and a weak hand. And, I think he maybe should have trusted that front right hand a little more, Nakatani. I saw him maybe in the 5th or 6th round. He tried to throw a big hook to the body, and I was like, where has that been? Because to me, the body work to Nakatani was going to be the key to this fight always. How dedicated he was to working to the body was going to determine whether or not he was going to be able to hurt Inoue in those late rounds. And the reason why he wasn't is because he didn't dedicate to the body enough, and specifically he didn't dedicate that front hand to the body. When you are a southpaw in an open stance matchup, you have a right hook to the liver right there. I'm right by my lamp, co-starring the lamp. When you're a southpaw in an open stance matchup, you have that right hook to the liver right there, and Nakatani just didn't take advantage of it. Now, it could be that because he felt that would open himself up, but man, Nakatani was very, very afraid of getting hit by that big shot from Inoue, and when you watch this fight back, it becomes very apparent exactly what fight you're watching. You're watching a fight where, despite Inoue being the smaller man, Inoue is definitely the one who is able to knock out Nakatani, and Nakatani is not able to knock out Inoue. And in my preview video, I stated that Nakatani's best chance to knock out Inoue in this fight was one of the, trademarks of his game, which is these big looping overhand shots where he throws his elbow and his shoulder into the shot, right? Full arm sort of length into the shot, not really caring what other part of his arm ends up hitting the opponent. And he landed a big clattering overhand like that with his full arm, where I swear every part of his arm hit Inoue's head. And Inoue just wore it. Inoue wore everything that Nakatani hit him with in this fight. And Nakatani was, astoundingly enough, not only able to move forward on him, but able to move forward on him and land combinations on him against the ropes, and also in other spots able to land significant counter punches. And, I think he was able to enact a good amount of his offense on Inoue, the way that Nakatani has always been able to on his opponents. It's just that to Inoue, it didn't make a difference. And to Nakatani, there was a very clear fear of getting hit, a very clear compensation for Inoue's power, for Inoue's movement, and for Inoue's technique the entire fight. That in the spirit of how you score fights, especially when you consider Inoue consistently winning the battle of the jabs, it was just very difficult for me to give a lot of these rounds to Nakatani. And I think the only rounds that I really gave to Nakatani were the ones where he spent a significant amount of the time actually on the front foot. I was never really going to give Nakatani rounds here counterpunching, just because of Inoue's actual, his jab and his footwork, his jab and his foot movement, his dominance of the positioning of the fight for the majority of the fight. And once these guys actually really got to trading, it was really magnificent to watch no matter where they were, because we got to see them trade in the center of the ring. We got to see them trade with Nakatani back against the ropes. We got to see them trade with Inoue back against the ropes. We really got to see everything. But we should have gotten to see a little more of it, and that's what I'm saying. I think this fight really should have been 15 rounds like the commentators were saying. I wasn't in love with the commentary on this fight. I think that it doesn't need to be, pumped up, pomp and circumstance. It doesn't need to have all this grandeur added to it. It's already the biggest fight in Japanese and quite possibly Asian history. It's to determine who the greatest fighter in Japanese history is. I think that Inoue has a pretty good case at being the greatest Asian boxer of all time against Manny Pacquiao after this, and certainly by the end of his career, I think he will. I think to people that know boxing and people that love the sport, and especially people that love Japanese boxing, this fight didn't need to be, it just seemed like they were trying to make too much of it, when it's like the fight's already a huge deal. It's in the Tokyo Dome, man. It's the two best Japanese fighters of all time. But the commentary was right in that this fight should have been 15 rounds. We got robbed, I think, of the final ebb and flow of this fight, where, I think they weren't really all the way tired yet, to the point of really having to sort of being forced to stand and trade in the pocket. And it felt like there was this air in the building as the fight ended of like, man, we didn't get to see the best part, did we? These guys were about to really be tired enough to have to stand in front of each other, and just, the big winging shots that would be there when they did. It's very clear that, we were about to get the real war part of the war, when you get the really concussive shots and the heavy damage, and you understand why 15-round fights don't exist anymore. But I think that 15-round fights did exist for fights like these, and for fighters like these who have that real, authentic, old-school skill set, because that's why there was no circling, no moving, no jabbing and moving in this fight, because they aren't really, in the spirit of this fight, they aren't really those kinds of fighters. And I think that's why you didn't get that, jabbing and moving, that, American defensive boxing with the moving in circles in this fight. You got an old school kind of war, actually. It's just that the head movement, the feigning, and the dodging stopped it from being that. But this actually, in a lot of ways, is kind of a fight out of the old school, in terms of the actual tact and the movement and the focus on head movement and dodging over, circling and cycling. And like I said, I read it as they're saving that for the rematch. They're saving that for the second fight. They don't really want to show each other their boxing if they don't have to. They're just going to stand in there and throw hands. And so I think if we got 9 more minutes of this fight, we could have got even a few more twists in this tale, and it would have been a whole other level of classic. And so my sort of rant on this whole 12 versus 15 round thing is that I think we should have the commissions do their actual job, right? If you've got two fighters like Nakatani versus Inoue, or like I said before, Shakur versus Teofimo, although I don't know that necessarily that fight should have been 15 in hindsight, but I said it before, and it could have been 15. It's just Teofimo would have gotten his face broken more, but hey, throw in the towel. Check on your fighter, throw in the towel, right? I mean, that's literally what throwing in the towel is for, right? Keeping an eye on your fighter, not letting him get damaged too much. But the commission should do their jobs and say, okay, we've got two 32-0 fighters who've barely ever been knocked down, who don't really take that much damage. Like, they're both world champions. They've been fighting since they were literal children. Why should this fight not be 15 rounds? So as a boxing fan, I would love it if they found out some way one day just to bring back 15-round fights in special circumstances, because I wish that we could just make these sporting commissions do their jobs and just say, you know, this fighter is very defensively protective and sound on a professional level for a long span of time, and so is this fighter. You know, we trust that these guys aren't going to kill each other over the course of 15 rounds, right? Like, seriously, how many timelines, as hard as Shakur beat Teofimo's ass, and how many timelines, even with 9 more minutes, keep in mind you can throw in the towel, even with 9 more minutes, and how many timeline does Shakur literally kill Teofimo, right? Because that's what we're talking about here. That's why 12 to 15 round fights were banned, because people would literally die, right? It's a horrible thing. It's a tragic thing. But if you go back and you look at most of the deaths that happen in 15 round fights, and of course deaths still happen in boxing. That guy's got a motorcycle. Did you know that? Deaths still happen in boxing under 10 round, 8 round, 6 round fights under these circumstances. You know, fighters that go for the KO. Obviously, that's going to happen. Fighters who just fight recklessly and have reckless offensive, non-defensive fight styles, that can happen. And that's an inevitable thing if you have fights that are sanctioned to go 15 rounds, or say all championship fights are sanctioned to go 15 rounds, right? You're obviously going to have offensive fighters getting into these crazy slugfests that just go on and on and on. And if the ref is just letting them go, then, you know, you're obviously at risk of, you know, the tragic incidents that we've seen in boxing actually happen. Like I said, we were robbed of this fight's final great ebb and flow because of, like, what? Inoue is going to just be comboing off on Nakatani in the ropes, and the ref's just not going to be stepping in. Like, let's be realistic here. It's a modern boxing referee. If one guy's getting comboed off on and not responding, the fight's going to be stopped pretty quickly. I don't care who's in there. And they're both just such great defensive operators with such great head movement, long track records at the championship level. They definitely could have gone in there and safely fought 3 more rounds without, you know, either of them sustaining a life-altering injury, I think. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all championship fights should be 15 rounds. I'm saying that in certain special circumstances, with excellent defensive fighters, undefeated fighters, fighters that show a proclivity for not being knocked down and for not taking significant damage throughout their careers, that when those fighters meet in special circumstances in super fights, so fights, for example, like this fight right here, Nakatani versus Inoue, Teofimo versus Shakur, Pacquiao versus Mayweather, just certain fights like that with, you know, high-level elite professionals fighting on a grand stage, I think that clearances could be made for those fights to be 15 rounds, with the caveat that, again, the fighters have to have a solid defensive track record at the highest level. The vast majority of fights, of championship fights, should not be 15 rounds. The vast majority of championship fights should be 12 rounds. I'd borderline say there should be an exception made that, like, only like unification or undisputed fights should be 15 rounds to begin with. But I think there should be some consideration given to bringing back 15 round fights just for the sake of the sport itself, for the sake of the art of boxing, for the sake of the betterment of the sport, for the sake of the betterment of sport itself, genuinely, because of how great I think 15 round fights can be. I think it's boxing at its ultimate best. I think it's combat sports at its ultimate best. If you disagree with me, go watch, you know, Leonard versus Hearns. Go watch many of the great 15-round fights of all time. And, you know, you're never going to get those rounds back because, like I said, they saved their boxing. They're saving their boxing. I think if you ever get a rematch between these two, first off, it would be years in the future because I think, and I'll get into this, the immediate next thing for both these men is not a rematch, I don't think. So first off, it'd be years in the future. And second off, you know, they haven't really shown each other their lateral movement of their boxing. So I think that's where that fight's going to start. And you can never really recreate that exact circumstance there, the start of what would have been round 13 when, you know, they're in that exact condition and, you know, the tale of the fight has been told the way that it has, where, I felt like Nakatani was about to have another, stronger stretch. He was sort of coming into a better stretch of fighting there at the end of the 12th round, and I honestly read it as more of a natural flow of Inoue. He had a really strong stretch, I would say, starting in round 10. The fight flowed really, really brilliantly. I feel like I'm going to have to go back now and go from the start of the fight, but, Nakatani, he definitely won. In my books, he won round 4 and round 5, I believe, and then Inoue really controlled the middle of the fight. Nakatani had another strong stretch in round 9 and round 10. The fight was a few days ago. Let me go check my scorecards. Scorecards in hand, yes. Nakatani won round 9 and round 10, and then Inoue, the best moment of the fight was Inoue round 11. He basically took control back of the fight, just landed this brilliant lead uppercut. It was the best moment of the fight, that uppercut to Nakatani in round 11, and the moment where I knew that Inoue really won this fight, was going to win this fight in most people's books. And he still won round 12 on my card, but Nakatani had a really strong round 12, and I thought that if there was a round 13, Nakatani probably would have had, another swell of the momentum back his way, and this fight would have just kept going. So, I'd obviously love to see a rematch of this fight, but we're not going to get a continuation of this fight when this fight was just really honestly just getting good after round 12. And that's why I've gone on this long thing here about, the structure of fights and, how many rounds a fight is, or how many rounds a fight should be sanctioned to be, because I just think there was something about this fight, and fights with a grandiose nature like this, with so much on the line between two fighters who are undefeated with such pedigree and such great defense. I think there's no reason why you can't have a regulatory body or a commission look at this and go, these guys are fine to fight 15 rounds. But anyway, on to what's next for both of these guys. I think for Inoue, there's a ton of options. For Nakatani, there's a ton of options. I don't think that there's a rematch in the immediate future for either of these guys. For Inoue, I look at Angelo Leo. You have to think about, further higher weight classes in the rest of his career. And, I always try to think about who's going to beat a fighter like that. You got both O'Shaquie Foster and Raymond Ford who are fighting later this month, who I think would present great challenges to Inoue up at a higher weight for different reasons. Foster because of his length, Ford because of his boxing skills and tempo dictation, just gamesmanship, craft. Nick Ball, I think, is also a slightly realistic opponent, a former Ford opponent. Shorter fighter, in need of a status-boosting win, coming off a loss. I think more likely you see Nick Ball get a win coming off that Figueroa loss, like just take an easier fight than Inoue, but he's wanted that Inoue fight for a really, really long time. And I think if Inoue wants a fight against somebody who's a more natural 122er, who's also got a fun offensive challenge, a new fight style for him. And, again, I'd love to see Inoue fight Sebastian Hernandez too. And I think that Nick Ball is kind of a smaller version of Sebastian Hernandez with the toughness and the forward moving pressure fighting. I think that would be a really, really fun sort of salvo of fights there for Inoue to do Ball and Sebastian Hernandez back to back. Because again, like I said, the day of the night of the Samurai card, I would like to see Inoue versus Sebastian Hernandez more than I would like to see, Hernandez versus Nakatani or Hernandez versus Nakatani run back. Because, man, like Nakatani, if he runs back to Hernandez, if he's got two crazy rematches, he won the first Hernandez fight, though. Apparently he won that fight. I've said it 5 times now on my channel, but I really don't think that Nakatani won that. And that's why I'd love to see that fight rematch. But I'd also love to see Inoue fight Sebastian Hernandez. There's also Anthony Kakache for Inoue. That's a really weird matchup. He's an Irish fighter who's really been dominant at these weights, big, unconventional. I think he's pretty much a switch hitter, southpaw, very dangerous offensive skill set. But I also think he lost his last fight, and he's very in between tempo kind of fighter. He kind of comes and goes with his gas tank in fights, and that's something that Inoue really doesn't play with. And then, of course, the fight that everybody talks about with Inoue is Bam Rodriguez. And I'd love to see that fight for the concussive power. I think that right now, if that fight happens right now, I think it's an obvious conclusion because Inoue, I think, really controls that fight up at this weight. I think he could control Bam's power up at that weight. It would be a little bit of Oscar De La Hoya versus Manny Pacquiao if Bam were able to pull that off. I think it would be a showcase of Bam's supreme boxing skills, which I think definitely do exist, but he would definitely have to use his boxing skills to outdo Inoue. And I think it would really just be a show of technique. That people talk about how great Bam Rodriguez's technique is, of course, and he does have great technique to go with his great power, but man, that would be certainly a test of it in Naoya Inoue, and it would definitely be a case where A lot of the boxing heads, and me certainly, like I did in Canelo versus Crawford, which is another fight you might compare that to if Bam were to win, where I would certainly underestimate, probably quote unquote underestimate Bam because of the size in that fight and because of the lethal technical ability of Naoya Inoue. And that's the last thing I wanted to say in this video, because it just reminds me of when I was talking about Kakache, and I was thinking about, a long, lanky, tough southpaw like Kakache sort of reminds me of Nakatani. Although Nakatani, again, that's a tougher fight than Kakache. Obviously, Nakatani's a better fighter and a younger fighter. So I think Inoue obviously beats Kakache, right? But the real reason why Inoue just, I think, would completely... I think he could probably shut out a fighter like Kakache and just dominate that fight, is because of Inoue's gas tank. And that was what was on display in this fight. And that's Inoue having a very unique trait amongst fighters. And it's a trait that not very many fighters in history have had. And it's a trait that you really only see in guys who really, really, really do road work, like really truly do their natural road work the way that you're supposed to, and are, as I say, a natural runner, right? Tyson Fury, Sugar Ray Leonard, and probably more than anybody in history, Floyd Mayweather. And this attribute that I'm talking about isn't necessarily your stamina. It's your ability to rejuvenate stamina within a fight. And that's something that we saw Inoue do 3 times. 3 times probably separately in this fight, was get what, that I think of the regular person would think of as a second wind, right? Inoue, Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, Floyd Mayweather, so many of the greatest fighters, Muhammad Ali, they constantly get a second wind because their gas tank is just built different. And I think it comes from just having like genuine marathon level endurance, right? Having long distance running kind of genes or actual long distance running conditioning, the ability to just rejuvenate stamina at a slightly faster rate than your opponent. And it could be that Nakatani, or Inoue's opponents forever will just think, no, people say, oh, his technique is better than mine. No, I have perfect technique. I'm sure Nakatani thinks that he's the perfect technical puncher, that he probably has better technique than Inoue. Nakatani might have better technique than Inoue. It might be a little bit of a Roy Jones situation. And you see that in this fight right here with all the different situations where Inoue would be ducking in, and then Nakatani, that was one of the best things about this fight. All the different times where Inoue would duck in, get caught in some unnatural position, because Nakatani is a long, lanky opponent, a longer, lankier opponent than Inoue's ever had to fight. All these situations where he was having to lunge in just to get these punches in, and whether or not it worked, he'd be in a vulnerable position. Nakatani would go to hit him in the vulnerable position, and Inoue would already be gone, right? He's able to make up for mistakes with his speed, and he's able to make his technique better and more consistent with his speed. And when you combine the speed and the technique with the gas tank, you're talking about a fighter who's impossible to deal with. You're talking about somebody who's going to have perfect technique for the entire 12-round distance and actually be able to maintain it the entire time. Because when Inoue throws a combination and takes a break, he's just more able to throw that next combination after taking that break, because that break fills the battery all the way back up. And there's all these different points in a fight where Inoue is going to come back out with a fully recharged battery when the other fighter is slowly draining back, like you see in any sports video game, in any fighting video game where your stamina bar over the course of the fight drains back. Inoue's drains back a little bit, goes back to 100. Drains back a little bit, goes back to 100. Drains back a little bit, goes back to 100. It's always going back to 100. There's always going to be a point where Inoue has full energy, and where his technique and where his speed and where everything is just locked in, right? And it makes Inoue damn near impossible to fight and damn near impossible to beat. You gotta be a power puncher. You gotta rock him. You gotta knock him out. It's the only way. And to Nakatani's credit, he did try to do that in this fight. It's just unfortunately he didn't have it. He didn't have the shot to knock him out. And I think Nakatani, begrudgingly, and that's part of, I think, what you saw in the body language at the end of the fight, I think he knows that he didn't win. And there's people that, scored this fight by 1 round, or even people that scored it a draw. And I just don't agree with that. I think that, if you really value counterpunching, and I think that's really the only way you could score for Nakatani. If you really value counterpunching, and I think maybe you'd also have to probably just ignore the jab battle. I think you'd have to just give Nakatani credit for some of those weak flick jabs onto Inoue's gloves that didn't really do anything. Because I think, unfortunately, Nakatani did have his jab kind of neutralized at points in this fight, and that was a big reason why Inoue also spent a majority of the time on the front foot. But like I said, this fight really brought to light Inoue's gas tank to me, and it's something that I'm going to watch for in his future fights, just how quickly he's able to rejuvenate his stamina and just how big of a part of his perfect technique that is. Because I've always praised Inoue as being this perfect technical fighter, and I definitely don't think that he is like Roy Jones, and that Roy Jones, the things that he did wrong in his technique were a little more obvious. But it's true that I think if Inoue didn't have the level of speed that he has, that a lot of the things that he does in there probably just wouldn't work, and that's how boxing works. And that at some point you have to fear for Inoue moving up in weight. One day he's going to start to slow down, and like I've said previously, whether it's against Sebastian Hernandez, whether it's against Angelo Leo, whether it's up even higher in weights against somebody like O'Shaquie Foster, somebody is going to be lucky enough to be in there against an Inoue who has slowed down a tick. And I think that part of the reason for this high fight volume from Inoue in his early 30s, in his late 20s, in this era of his career where he's, really making his mark on boxing history, it's not just to win all these belts and win all these championships. Of course, that's part of it, but it's because I think Inoue doesn't necessarily see himself as a fighter who's going to age particularly well, or that he's going to have to fight a much more measured and much more tactful approach when he's an older man, and that he understands that, a lot of the things that he's going to do to win these fights and to beat these great fighters, he's just not going to be able to do in the future because he doesn't have the speed. I think that Inoue is very, very realistic about his own skill set and about his own ability, and that's part of why he's so technically perfect. Because, again, another thing highlighted by this performance is just how often Inoue makes the right decision, how often Inoue does the right thing. And, when he gets that second wind, that 11th round was just a masterpiece. If you could award somebody a win, a championship belt off of just 3 minutes, off of just one round, that would be the round for Inoue, where you give him just a decision just off of that round. And that's not how you score fights. Inoue definitely won this fight on my card significantly. I'll read you guys the actual card round by round. I had Inoue taking the first 3 rounds, with round 3 being the only close round. Nakatani then took rounds 4 and 5. Inoue then took 6, 7, and 8, with rounds 6 and 8 being close. I believe a lot of people scored those rounds, especially round 8 for Nakatani. I was probably one of the only people who had Inoue winning round 8. By that point, it was 78-74 for Inoue, before Nakatani took rounds 9 and 10 to make it 96-94 through 10 to that point. Inoue then clutched up, locked in the championship rounds of that fantastic round 11 and the closing in round 12. Nakatani made a good performance there at the end of round 12, but it wasn't enough to cinch him the round for me, and I gave it Nakatani 116-112. Inoue 116-112. It's been a long video, guys. Sorry. Inoue 116-112. With Inoue winning round 11 and round 12. Yeah, so those are my thoughts on Inoue versus Nakatani. It's my final scorecard. Let me know what you guys thought about this fight. Let me know what you guys had on your scorecards, and let me know what you guys think is next for both of these fighters. And I'll be back very, very soon with more content. I'll probably make a whole video about who next for Naoya Inoue, and I may touch on Nakatani, because I'm sure there were some people I missed during that segment of this video. But yeah, this has been a real long one, guys. Hopefully I'll have this out within the next couple of days. I'm filming this on Monday, so hopefully it's out Tuesday or Wednesday, or maybe even Monday night. But yeah, I will see you guys on the next one. Peace out, and like and subscribe.